Life isn't something that happens to you, it's how you reorganize what's happening. Try asking yourself this, not with skepticism, but with the utmost honesty you possess. Have you ever been truly engrossed to the point of forgetting who you are? A peculiar moment when time ceases to flow, when the self no longer reflects on others, when every cell in you merges into one with the action. You're not living, you're asterisk in the flow. And that's why I chose Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Not because it's a classic, not because it's cited in TED Talks or self-help rankings, but because it speaks of a lived experience that people can feel even before understanding it intellectually. This book won't teach you how to get rich or promise you happiness. It does something harder. It helps you reassemble the scattered pieces of your life to see that they were never random. If you've ever felt life slipping through your fingers, not in a tragic way, but in a diluted, shapeless manner, then you should live with this book, rather than just read it. Don't just listen to me, or even the author. Turn each page with the mindset of someone finding their way back to a home they'd forgotten. And if what I share touches something within you, an old crack, a small glimmer of light, then consider joining this journey. Not for algorithms, but because sometimes we need a shared rhythm to reflect on how we are truly living. I don't promise that this will change your life. I only hope that just once in your life, you'll have a moment where you look up and whisper, "Ah, this is when I'm truly alive." And if that happens, this journey will have been entirely worth it. Now, let me tell you briefly why I'm recommending this book. I'll begin. You might live in a house 3 times larger than your actual needs, walk on cold tiles without feeling cool, lie in a splendid living room, yet feel your life is as small as a speck of dust. The wealthiest people I've met often don't lack things to buy, but they always lack a reason to get up early in the morning. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, a name many struggle to pronounce, doesn't try to sugarcoat anything. He doesn't promise to lead you to a land of peace or teach you how to master your destiny. Instead, he pulls you back to a simple, heart-piercing question. If we have all the conditions for happiness, why do we still feel miserable? What we call happiness is often conflated with comfort. You can turn the air conditioner to 23 degrees Celsius, sit on an imported sofa, and drink a perfect Colombian coffee. But none of those things guarantee you're living a life of depth. Mihaly begins by stripping the concept of happiness of all the luxurious layers the modern world has draped over it. And he doesn't speak based on intuition. He was a scientist, and for decades, his research team conducted hundreds of thousands of real-time recordings of human psychological states in all walks of life, all social strata, all continents. He called it the experience sampling method, where people not only reported feeling happy or miserable, but also recorded when, where, and what they were doing when those emotions appeared. The results were unlike anything you might read in self-help books. It turned out that the moments described as happiest didn't come from resting, entertaining themselves, or spending. They appeared in strange times, solving math problems, gardening, playing music, fixing machinery, working passionately, even sometimes in the midst of a crisis. In other words, happiness doesn't come from doing less, but from doing things wholeheartedly. In a world driven by data and performance, that insight feels like a slap in the face to consumerist thinking. Mihaly offers an entirely different definition. Happiness is when you reach a state of flow, where the self disappears, time dissolves, and you merge with the action as if nothing else exists. Imagine you're an entrepreneur in the midst of product development. You work 14 hours a day, but don't feel tired. You forget to eat, forget deadlines. You only know you're living in every decision, every line of code, every step of testing. No one needs to push you, no rewards are necessary, no praise is sought. The work itself is the reward. That is flow. And that is the only thing Mihaly believes is worth pursuing for a lifetime. He explains that human consciousness is like a limited processor. You can only focus on a certain number of experiences at any given moment. And if you don't actively direct the stream of information flowing into your mind, it will turn into chaos. That's why many people, even when idle, feel restless. Leisure doesn't lead to happiness if we don't know what to do with it. Mihaly tells of people living in adversity who still had positive life experiences, like a paraplegic woman who found flow in painting with her mouth, or a worker in harsh conditions who still felt the day flew by because he could fix machinery like solving a complex problem. They weren't happy because their circumstances were pleasant. They were happy because they found a way to reorganize their consciousness to turn any circumstance into a vivid game. There's a frightening truth Mihaly points out. Most people live without ever experiencing a state of flow. They live on inertia, reacting to external events, controlled by trends, by advertisements, by social pressures. They think they are free, but they are actually caught in a countercurrent, a flow without direction, without control, and ultimately without meaning. If you are in business, you might easily confuse being busy with living in flow. You might think you're at your peak, handling dozens of emails, going in and out of meetings constantly, signing million-dollar contracts. But Mihaly would ask you, what percentage of that time do you truly feel immersed in the action, forgetting yourself, and finding everything seamless and natural? That question isn't easy to answer. But if you can answer it, you'll also know whether you're truly living or just surviving. When Mihaly presents the concept of consciousness as an energy system, he isn't just playing with words. He describes consciousness as a limited capital flow, like a business budget. If you don't actively allocate it, it will naturally drift to the easiest expenditures. Instant gratification, quick and hollow emotions. This might seem contradictory to the popular belief that freedom to do what you like, think what you want leads to happiness. But Mihaly clarifies that freedom doesn't come with quality of experience if there's no internal structure. Meaning, you might be so free that no one can control you, but you can't even control yourself. Internal chaos, as he describes it, is the underlying condition for simmering dissatisfaction, for the feeling of meaninglessness that many successful people often experience. They've reached the top but don't know what for. They've won the game but no longer find it interesting. Mihaly doesn't judge. He points out that the problem isn't the destination, but how the journey is experienced from within. One example he gives is how many people look forward to holidays to relax, but then feel empty during the break. The reason is that resting often lacks clear goals, immediate feedback, and the ability to act and control the very elements that create flow. In other words, they escape work not to live, but to drift. Mihaly also cites studies showing that children playing passionately enter a state of flow much more naturally than adults. Not because children are smarter, but because no psychological barriers interrupt the connection between them and their actions. They don't care if anyone is judging, if they're achieving, or if they're being recognized. They do it simply because the act itself is engaging. That is primal flow, something we lose as we grow older. Adults, especially in business environments, often use achievements to measure self-worth. But Mihaly reminds us that those who achieve the deepest states of flow often don't focus on results at all. They focus on the process, and that's what helps them live more deeply and sustainably, regardless of the outcome. Imagine an artist painting. If he's too concerned with whether the painting will sell, he won't be in flow. If an entrepreneur is too calculating about the ROI for every hour, he will never experience that timeless feeling of creating a new product. You can't both control too tightly and live fully. Flow requires a kind of letting go, not letting go of the action, but letting go of the ego. Mihaly also points out something few dare to say. Happiness doesn't necessarily come with comfort in all cases. In some instances, states full of tension, complexity, even elements of pain, are precisely what create the deepest flow, like a mountaineer, bruised and battered, but upon reaching the summit, feels their mind open like a long dusty door suddenly flung wide. You cannot measure contentment solely by a smile. It must be measured by the depth of the experience. At this point, Mihaly's Chapter 1 becomes dangerous in a good way. He demolishes almost all common assumptions about a good life. No more believing that having more means being happier. No more believing that rest is the ultimate reward. No more believing that freedom is the solution. All must be reevaluated if you truly want to live fully. And to do that, he believes people need to learn a skill rarely taught. Redesigning internal experience, not changing circumstances, because that's not easy, but changing how we interact with those circumstances. Just as a smart investor doesn't pour money into an easy market, but seeks to correctly read market psychology, so too, a person in flow doesn't choose easy work, but chooses to work differently. Mihaly describes optimal experience as an order in consciousness. And to create that order, you need an activity with clear enough goals, complex enough to be engaging, flexible enough for you to control, and attractive enough for you to forget time. Without these elements, flow does not occur. And without flow, happiness is just a hovering promise. So he asks not with a question, but with the cold gaze of a scientist who has listened to tens of thousands of states of consciousness. How will you live the rest of your life? Chasing short-term pleasant stimuli, or learning to create an internal mental ecosystem rich enough, coherent enough, for you to feel that every day is part of something meaningful? That's not a call to action, it's a blueprint for living. Imagine you're an executive. You walk into the office in the morning, and before you even sit down, your inbox is full of complaints. The phone rings continuously, your assistant reports a key employee has resigned, and an important meeting is rescheduled at the last minute. And in that chaos, a tiny part of your mind still whispers, is all this really necessary? Mihaly begins this chapter not with a declaration, but with a mental surgery. He doesn't ask how you're feeling, but how your consciousness is operating. This is no longer a philosophical issue, it's a technology for survival. If you don't understand the structure of your consciousness, it's like running a company without knowing where the budget is. Consciousness, according to Mihaly, isn't a vague dark mass but a limited energy system that can be measured, analyzed, and optimized. It's the processing center for every experience. Anything you feel, think, or decide passes through it. And like a closed economic system, you can't spend beyond your means. If misused, you fall into an attention deficit. If allocated wisely, you generate an experience surplus. Every day, we face thousands of streams of information, but only a tiny fraction is allowed into the illuminated zone of consciousness. And the frightening thing is that most people leave that filtering power to circumstances, advertising, news, and social media. All of them compete for control of your consciousness. You think you're free, but you're actually being remotely controlled. Mihaly calls the control of consciousness a prerequisite for happiness, a gentle way of stating a harsh truth. If you don't know what you're thinking, you don't know how you're living. He divides consciousness into two main parts, intention and attention. Intention is what you want. Attention is the energy you expend to achieve it. A person with strong intentions but no control over attention is like a CEO with a grand vision who doesn't know how to manage cash flow. Sooner or later, chaos will ensue. Flow occurs only when there's absolute synchronization between intention and attention. You don't just want to do something, you pour all your mental energy into it. Nothing interrupts, no distracting fragments. The entire internal system points to one spot, and in that moment, you are no longer separate from the action. You become the action itself. To illustrate, Mihaly recounts the story of a wood craftsman. He could spend hours sanding a small corner of a table. Not because anyone asked, not because anyone paid him, but because in that moment, everything felt right. The outside world ceased to matter, time lost its weight, and all that remained was the movement of his hands, the grain of the wood, and a concentration as sharp as a blade. In business, this state is not uncommon but often misunderstood. People confuse flow with busyness, hard work with being fully present in the action. Mihaly draws a clear line. If you work and still have to check the clock every 10 minutes, you're not in flow. If you need someone's recognition to continue, you're not in flow. Flow is when the action itself is enough to make you forget yourself, your goals, even the reward. He also emphasizes an important point. The conscious system is not fixed. It can be trained just like muscles. The more correctly you use it, the more flexible, powerful, and precise it becomes. But this requires sustained mindfulness, not the kind of mindfulness printed on a t-shirt, but a silent discipline, like a professional chess player training to sense every move of their opponent. Mihaly suggests, think of consciousness as a mental startup. If you don't control your mental energy expenditure, if you don't analyze the flow of experience, if you don't adjust your focus strategy, you will constantly incur losses, and the price will be a life lacking depth, direction, and true pleasure. Mihaly doesn't shy away from the cruel consequences when a person loses control of their consciousness. He describes it as a form of slow self-destruction, not with a knife or fire, but with incessant dispersion. You wake up intending to write a plan, then get lost in a news rabbit hole, then social media, then messages, then guilt, then stress, and then you forget what you originally wanted. And when that repeats for hundreds of days, thousands of weeks, you will wake up one morning and no longer know who you are. It doesn't happen suddenly. It occurs as a subtle, gradual slide, like a train derailing millimeter by millimeter. Mihaly calls it conscious energy leakage, an image that couldn't be more accurate. Every time you relinquish control of your attention, you don't just lose focus, you lose your identity. He provides a series of examples to prove this, from a homemaker who feels invisible amidst the whirlwind of childcare, to a young man addicted to gaming, not out of passion, but because it's the only place he feels a semblance of power. In all cases, the common thread is a neglected conscious system unorganized, undirected, and the consequence is a growing sense of emptiness. Conversely, Mihaly describes people who, even in unpleasant circumstances, maintain internal vitality. A factory worker who knows how to turn each repetitive task into a small challenge to overcome. An elderly widow who creates games for herself while doing housework. They don't wait for the world to bring them excitement, they proactively construct experiences from within. That might sound trivial, but Mihaly proves that this is the core of our capacity for living. Not IQ, not EQ, not background, but the ability to control and organize consciousness in all situations. A crucial point he makes is flexibility. Consciousness should not be too rigid, because then it easily breaks when faced with the unexpected. But it also shouldn't be too loose, because then it will be usurped. Much like a business system needs robust processes, but also room for creativity. A person who controls their consciousness well knows when to focus and when to relax, and does so intentionally. Mihaly calls this an integrated self, not a rigid, arrogant, immutable self, but a flexible system. It knows what it wants, what to care about, and what to reject if it doesn't serve that internal structure. It is here that he poses an extremely sharp paradox. True freedom doesn't come from being able to do anything, but from being able not to do what is unnecessary. This is a definition entirely contrary to how modern society often teaches us to understand freedom. And if you're living in the business world, where every piece of information, every person, every call competes for your attention, you need to understand this better than anyone. Every time you answer an unnecessary email, you are withdrawing mental capital from an important investment. Every time you let insecurity drive your behavior, you are breaking your own internal structure. So, how do you reorganize consciousness? Mihaly doesn't offer a simple exercise. He doesn't advise meditating for 10 minutes each morning or writing a gratitude journal. Instead, he asks you to become a true architect. Observe each stream of thought as you would a blueprint. Measure the flow of attention as you would structural forces in a building. You must see the fragments in your mind and then reassemble them into a mental ecosystem. And only then will flow occur. Not because you are good enough, skilled enough, or successful enough, but because you have created an internal structure that allows consciousness to flow like a river through the canyons of life without dams breaking, without springs drying up. Mihaly concludes Chapter 2 with an undisguised warning. If you don't control your consciousness, you will be its victim. Just as an out-of-control business system will go bankrupt, an internally uncontrolled life will become lost, dissatisfied, and ultimately mentally paralyzed. Internal freedom, he says, doesn't come from emotion, it comes from structure. And that structure isn't given to you, you must build it yourself. There's something experienced people know but rarely say. The quality of life isn't proportional to the amount of wealth or the favorability of circumstances. It's proportional to a much more elusive variable: enjoyment. Here, enjoyment isn't consumption, pure pleasure, or simply feeling good. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi wants us to strip away that common definition and look at the core. Enjoyment is when we are fully present in an experience, feeling it like an electric current running through body and mind, and then realizing we are truly living, not just passing through. And as always, he doesn't say this in mystical language. He analyzes it like an economist dissecting value. Enjoyment is a form of emotional profit that occurs when an experience simultaneously meets three criteria: clear goals, challenging nature, and immediate feedback. If one of these three is missing, the emotion you receive will be fleeting. But if all three are present, you step into a special energy zone where you and the world are no longer separate. Mihaly gives an example. Two people go mountain climbing. One complains about being tired, is annoyed about no phone signal, and just wants it to end. The other takes each step as if every rock is a dialogue with nature. Same circumstances, same weather, same slope. But the lived experience is worlds apart, and the difference lies in the ability to organize the internal experience. This is where he begins to distinguish himself from all simplistic theories of happiness. He says, "You cannot be made happy. No one, not even the world, can give you a good experience. You must learn to create them. Like a craftsman who doesn't sit waiting for wood to turn into a chair, you must actively participate in creating the value of each moment." And from that, he offers a shocking definition. Enjoyment is a sign of psychological growth. It's not a purely emotional reaction, but a byproduct of striving. You only truly enjoy when you have to overcome something. It doesn't have to be a major obstacle, but it must be a deliberate effort. Mihaly tells the story of an amateur violinist who doesn't perform, has no audience, no one pays them. That person dedicates an hour each evening to practice every note, every scale, every solo, all played with a concentration no less than a professional artist. And that person feels deep contentment, not because of the result, but because they are fully alive in the process. It is this commitment to the process that makes life worth living. For Mihaly, this isn't just an isolated case, it's a survival principle. He points out that enjoyment doesn't appear when you consume, but when you participate. The deeper you participate, the more actively you reorganize your experience, the more capable you are of tasting the true quality of life. And in the business world, where everything is measured by ROIs and KPIs, this concept might seem vague. But he offers an irrefutable argument. A business that doesn't create enjoyable experiences for its founder and employees will, sooner or later, lose its soul. You might achieve financial goals, but if no one on the team feels alive while working, that company is just a machine, and machines can be replaced. Mihaly encourages a very different way of living, not living to maximize comfort, but living to maximize the quality of experience. Every action, no matter how small, can become a point of enjoyment if you know how to set goals, create challenges, and receive feedback. Even repetitive tasks like washing dishes or writing emails can become a living ritual instead of a mechanical chore. He doesn't romanticize life, but he believes that if people learn to redesign their inner experience to touch true enjoyment, then even in less than ideal conditions, they can live with a sense of fullness, sharpness, and direction. Mihaly doesn't simplify enjoyment into a formula. He very decisively separates it from the concept of pleasure. Pleasure is what you get when everything is readily served: a delicious meal, beautiful music, a captivating movie. It's passive, short-term, easy to consume, and therefore often leaves us feeling empty afterward. Enjoyment, on the other hand, requires you to participate in its creation. You're not just a user, but a co-creator. This difference is extremely important because modern society, according to Mihaly, has done too good a job of producing pleasure, but has almost forgotten how to nurture enjoyment, from the food industry to media. Everything is designed to create an immediate reflex, but rarely does anything demand mental effort from you. The consequence is a society saturated with stimuli, but lacking depth. Mihaly doesn't urge us to abandon comfort or live austerely. He merely proposes a shift in focus, from consuming life to designing life. This means you don't wait for a holiday, a party, or a promotion to feel satisfied. You transform every day, every hour, even when doing seemingly mundane tasks, into an experience that has structure, purpose, and meaning. He tells of a senior manager he once interviewed. This person initially thought that joy in work only came from big wins, million-dollar deals, market expansion, successful fundraising. But later, he realized what truly excited him was handwriting each presentation slide, tweaking every number, building every line of the script to persuade investors. The deepest joy came not from the peak, but from delving into the details. That's what Mihaly calls the beauty of the process. When you learn to love each step, no matter how small or challenging, the process itself becomes the reward. If you only focus on the outcome, then each day that passes will just be a rationalized wait. He analyzes that true enjoyment is never accidental. It's the result of a trained mental system that knows how to focus, how to set appropriate challenges, how to generate its own feedback, how to detect small progress and acknowledge it. A person with this ability will live distinctly from the average person, not because their circumstances are better, but because they can transform any circumstance into vibrant living material. Mihaly also offers an observation that exposes modern society. Many people believe that the quality of life increases when they have more choices, but the truth is the opposite. The more choices, the easier it is to be scattered. The more scattered, the harder it is to focus. And when you can't focus, you can't enjoy. You might have 500 songs in your playlist, but if you listen while scrolling on your phone, you won't remember any melody. In a world saturated with stimuli, the ability to focus on a single experience is a superpower. The person with that superpower isn't someone who endures well, but someone who knows how to create meaning from what they do. Mihaly doesn't describe them as saints, he describes them as extremely realistic people. They know that every minute lived is an asset, and if it's an asset, it must be invested, not squandered. He suggests that if each person could design 2-3 activities each day according to the flow structure, meaning having goals, challenges, feedback, the quality of life would significantly improve. No need for leaps and bounds, just building small bricks of experience. And if you maintain it over time, you won't need to search for happiness anymore, because you'll already be living in it. Mihaly concludes this chapter with a simple yet evocative image. Life is like a musical composition where you are both the player, the composer, and the listener. If you play awkwardly, the music will be off-key. If you play mechanically, it will be bland. But if you play with full presence, each note will become crisp. Each melody will bear your unique imprint, and that is the quality of a life of depth. Have you ever seen a musician play as if the world has disappeared, or a surfer with unblinking eyes, body and wave harmonizing like a symphony, or an engineer coding, forgetting hunger, thirst, day and night? All these moments, whether from art, sport, intellectual labor, or manual work, share a peculiar commonality. A state of intensely focused consciousness where the person is no longer separate from the action. Mihaly calls this flow. And in this chapter, he decides to delve into an essential question: can this state be repeated? If so, what conditions create it? In economics, we don't just care about the product, but also the production process. If flow is the optimal experience, then Mihaly's question is, what formula produces it? And like a mental strategist, he begins to disassemble this experience into its components, not to break its beauty, but to find a way to recreate it in even the most ordinary circumstances. The first condition: clear goals. No one enters flow if they don't know what they're doing. You can live dreamily, but you can't achieve a state of flow if your mind drifts aimlessly. Mihaly analyzes that even a small goal immediately provides consciousness with a point of focus. It's like shining a light into a dark corner of the mind, allowing all internal energy to converge there. The carpenter wants to cut a table corner perfectly. The doctor wants to stitch a wound without leaving a scar. The chef wants to time the boil just right. This clarity is the first door to flow. But goals alone are not enough. The second condition: immediate feedback. Try to imagine playing a video game but having to wait an hour to know if you won or lost, or painting a picture but not seeing the colors until next week. A state of flow cannot exist in delayed space. For the mind to be completely immersed, it needs to know almost immediately that the action it just performed had an effect. It doesn't have to be praise. Sometimes it's just the feeling of a finger hitting the right piano key, or seeing data return with the correct syntax, or simply the satisfied sigh of a customer when you've just finished a product. Mihaly emphasizes that feedback doesn't necessarily come from outside. The master of flow is someone who builds their own internal feedback system. They perceive every small step of progress. They read subtle signals in the process, and that very ability allows them to maintain uninterrupted immersion. The third and crucial condition: challenge balanced with skill. If a task is too easy, you'll get bored. If it's too difficult, you'll feel anxious. Flow occurs when the challenge is just enough to force you to exert your full abilities, but doesn't exceed your limits to the point of feeling helpless. Mihaly illustrates this with a simple but sharp graph. The y-axis is the difficulty of the challenge, the x-axis is the level of skill. The flow zone lies exactly in the middle, where these two elements are in dynamic balance. As you get better, the challenge needs to increase. When the challenge is high, you must learn more skills, otherwise flow will break. This might sound obvious, but Mihaly points out that most organizations, schools, and even families fail to maintain that balance zone. People are given tasks that are too easy or too difficult. Children are forced to learn things unsuited to their level. Employees are burned out by overwhelming work, or conversely, crammed into monotonous tasks. And when the balance zone is broken, flow has no place to live. With that analysis, Mihaly lays the foundation for a completely new kind of life design. Design based on the rhythm between challenge and ability. You don't choose work because it's easy or hard. You choose it because it has the potential to create flow, and then you adjust, either raising your skills or lowering the difficulty to always keep yourself in the most vibrant energy zone. Mihaly goes beyond the three basic conditions to trace more subtle nuances, additional pieces without which flow will never reach the necessary depth. He observes that people who frequently achieve flow are not only technically proficient or mentally disciplined, they are also extremely good at limiting distractions. This means that for flow to occur, you need an environment capable of supporting high concentration. It doesn't necessarily mean absolute silence, but it must have structure. A professional gamer can become immersed in a noisy tournament, but their perspective, goals, reflexes all are already organized. Conversely, a person sitting in an open-plan office with constant alerts and emails popping up will not be able to maintain any state of concentration long enough for flow to ignite. Mihaly advocates for withdrawing from certain aspects of life. He encourages redesigning one's way of living, much like an architect knows how to adjust light, ventilation, and materials. A person who wants to live in flow also needs to know how to organize their time, space, and especially their mind. He describes a phenomenon he calls deliberate loss of self. This means that when you enter flow, you temporarily forget your individual self. But not because you are lost, rather because you actively dissolve into the process. This is an advanced state, and it only occurs when the three prior conditions: goals, feedback, challenge, skill are met, plus a certain degree of trust in the action you are performing. In the business world, this might sound like the zone, a state where people working forget everything around them. But Mihaly clearly distinguishes. Flow is not about racing against time, nor is it about working like a machine. Flow is when every moment carries meaning, and you perceive it with your full mental presence. One of the deepest parts of this chapter is when he analyzes that the state of flow is not just a personal privilege. It can be the structure of an organization. That is, if a company knows how to design work so that employees are always challenged appropriately, have clear goals, receive quick feedback, and have autonomy in the process, then the entire organization will be like a flow ecosystem. He cites examples from design companies, software firms, and laboratories where employees describe the feeling of going to work as no different from playing a creative game. They don't need to force themselves to concentrate, no one needs to supervise them. Because the work itself, if designed correctly, is a self-operating engine. Mihaly calls this a flow organization, where mental energy is regenerated, not depleted. But perhaps the most subtle thing he shares is the following paradox. Flow cannot be forced, but it can be prepared for. You can't say, I will achieve flow at 8:00 a.m. tomorrow. But you can arrange all the conditions, choose the right task, create a suitable environment, set appropriate challenges, and learn internal feedback. If you do that long enough, flow will come not like a miracle, but as a natural consequence. Mihaly doesn't promise that this state will be easy to achieve, but he demonstrates that people who spend many hours each week in flow, regardless of what they do, generally have higher life satisfaction, more stable energy, and especially feel their lives have direction. And that is the difference between a life with internal order and a life chasing external stimuli. He concludes Chapter 4 with a seemingly gentle statement that encapsulates his entire philosophy of life. Life is not what happens to you, it's how you restructure what's happening. And flow is not a reward for the lucky, it's the result of living as a creator. Not just creating products, but creating one's own experience, hour by hour, minute by minute, moment by moment. Modern humans often treat their bodies like rented cars. They use them to move from one meeting to another party, to work, to eat, to dress. And they usually only pay attention to it when it starts to break down. We talk about the mind, emotions, spiritual experiences, but forget that all of these happen within a limited, complex, yet incredible biological machine. In this chapter, Mihaly takes us back to the beginning, the physical self. Not to glorify the body as an aesthetic object, but to show that the body itself is the first gateway to flow. He tells stories of mountaineers, skydivers, dancers, swimmers, athletes, martial artists, people whose feeling of dissolving into action occurs not through some vague belief, but through the precise combination of heart rate, breath, mechanical pressure, and reflexive processing ability. Flow in such cases is no longer a metaphor, it's a physical reality. A skier cannot think about deadlines while hurtling down a slope at 60 km/h. A dancer cannot think about fame when every muscle group is straining to maintain balance. At that moment, the body forces the mind to be present, and it is in that moment of complete convergence, with no boundary between the physical and the conscious, that flow appears. Mihaly emphasizes that the body is not a tool controlled by the mind. It is a part of consciousness, and if you neglect or suppress it, you are losing one of the most direct entry points to the state of flow. He analyzes the difference between 3 types of interaction with the body. 1. Consumption, where the body is a tool for enjoyment, eating, sleeping, pleasure. 2. Avoidance, where the body is seen as a burden, pain, illness, aging. 3. Active partnership, where the body is a companion in experience, moving, creating, exploring. Only the 3rd type sets the stage for flow, and it demands an entirely different relationship. You don't own your body, you live with it. The interesting thing is that you don't need to be an athlete to experience flow through the body. Mihaly tells of gardeners, hikers, rowers, Tai Chi practitioners' activities that are not glamorous or performative, but if done with focus, they still generate a deep state of immersion. A busy entrepreneur might find mental recovery not in the gym, but in 20 minutes of cycling each morning when there are no spreadsheets, no notifications, just the steady rhythm of their legs and deep breaths. A software engineer might find mental clarity in running, not to burn calories, but because each stride is a unit of structured life. Mihaly clearly distinguishes between body activities with flow and mere physical activities. Walking on a treadmill while watching videos or listening to podcasts is not flow. Playing a soccer game with your mind elsewhere is not flow. Flow only occurs when the action is an end in itself, when the movement itself brings joy and meaning. He also acknowledges a reality. Modern society does not encourage us to respect the body as a source of flow. It forces us to sit for long periods, move little, live in glass houses, eat industrial food, sleep little, consume much. The body becomes a victim needing recovery rather than a partner to live with. And thus, flow from the body becomes increasingly rare, replaced by stimuli from screens and chatter. A sharp point Mihaly makes is that when we use the body as a tool to achieve flow, we not only enhance the quality of the current experience, but also restructure our perception of self. The body in a state of flow is no longer a receptacle for anxieties about appearance, age, or gender. It becomes a precise, subtle machine serving clear life goals. You no longer care how you look. You care what you're doing, what you are feeling, how present you are in the moment. Mihaly tells of a middle-aged woman who started learning to swim at 50. Initially, she just wanted to improve her health, but gradually, swimming became a ritual where she could merge with the water, listen to her body, and feel every movement. No audience, no scoring, just water, moving skin, and a profound silence. She described the feeling as coming home to myself, but for the first time. In this context, Mihaly presents a proposition that seems counterintuitive but is deeply resonant. If you want to live as a spiritual being, first, live fully with your body. This seems simple, but contradicts many things that control us daily. Advertisements encourage us to consume to forget our bodies. Technology makes us live in our heads. Education promotes intellect but devalues physical activity. The result is millions of people living like disembodied heads, cut off from the very source of experience. Mihaly doesn't urge us to become athletes or dancers. He merely invites a reconciliation between the mechanical and conscious parts of human beings. He proves with hundreds of real-life accounts that flow from the body is not only real, but also one of the most accessible forms of flow. It requires no degree, no innate talent. It only requires you to dare to engage in physical action wholeheartedly. Another key point he analyzes is the sensory order in the state of flow from the body. You are not attacked by sensations, you control them. You are not dominated by pain, nor lost in trivial pleasures. Instead, you create a harmonious sensation, as if body and mind are operating at the same frequency. That is the foundation of mental autonomy. He says that if you train the ability to enter flow through the body, you also train many other fundamental capacities: focus, perseverance, sensitivity, and especially humility when you face your own physical limits, muscles trembling, breath ragged, heart pounding. You cannot lie to yourself. You are forced to listen, adjust, and respect. And in that process, the self is reshaped, not by theory, but by direct experience. Another important point: flow from the body can spread to other areas. Mihaly observes that people who regularly engage in immersive physical activities like martial arts, climbing, or dancing often achieve higher flow in their work, creativity, and even relationships. The reason is that they have learned an extremely rare skill: knowing how to listen to themselves in action, and that is the foundation for being fully present in any experience. He concludes the chapter with a simple yet groundbreaking acknowledgement. In a world obsessed with speed and efficiency, the simplest way to return to oneself is to walk. No purpose, no deadline, no headphones. Not to exercise, not to relieve stress, but to remind yourself that you still have a body. And that is the starting point for living a truly quality life. There's a paradox no one wants to admit. The less one does, the more chaotic the human mind tends to become. In the freest moments, no meetings, no emails, no chores, many people feel most insecure. Not because anything is wrong, but because they are suddenly forced to confront themselves, and that self turns out to be an extremely messy place. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi doesn't write this chapter as a sage or a Zen master. He writes as an architect of inner life, someone who has dissected hundreds of thousands of experience samples to understand when thought helps people live more deeply and when it drowns them in noise. And what he discovered is that thought, like the body, can become a doorway to flow, but only if we know how to organize it. Right from the start, he makes a clear distinction. Not all thinking is valuable thinking. Many people confuse thinking a lot with thinking deeply and worrying with strategic deliberation. He cites research showing that most of the time, people use their minds to repeat anxieties, reconstruct grudges, or deplete themselves with unanswerable questions. And so, he asks, how can thinking become a creative act instead of a consuming behavior? He begins by describing flow experiences that occur in purely intellectual fields: mathematics, writing, programming, design, philosophy, scientific research. He describes moments when people forget to eat and sleep to pursue an idea, when each line of thought becomes a step forward in a creative labyrinth. No one forces them, no immediate reward exists, only the pure enchantment of a logical sequence gradually becoming clear. That is the flow of thought. To achieve that state, Mihaly identifies conditions similar to those for the body. Clear goals, e.g., proving a theorem, finishing a chapter, fully understanding an idea, a challenge level appropriate to intellectual skills, and feedback. Here, feedback doesn't come from outside, but from the internal structure of thought itself, e.g., knowing that you are getting closer to the solution. He tells of scientists, musicians, programmers, people who can live for hours in this state where the stream of thought flows like an underground river, and they simply swim along, exploring, refining. They no longer ask, "What am I thinking for?" The process of thinking itself is the reward. Mihaly compares this to negative thought states, when people lack goal structure, receive no feedback, and are trapped in useless loops of anxiety, rumination, and baseless assumptions. He calls this cognitive entropy, a form of uncontrolled mind usage, where each thought generates a side branch and the entire system falls into a state of paralysis. From this, he leads to a crucial concept: structured thinking. This is not a natural skill, it must be trained. Just as a good programmer knows how to organize source code to be readable, modifiable, and extensible, a person who knows how to think also needs the ability to organize logic, branch ideas, test hypotheses, and adjust direction when necessary. Thinking is not a rain shower, it is a water management system. And those who don't learn to build channels for their thoughts will forever live in floods. Mihaly recounts a mathematician describing the state of flow while working. Every time I get close to the solution, it feels like listening to music. There's a rhythm, a progression, and if I miss a note, everything collapses. This shows that the flow of thought is not as dry as we might imagine. It has an aesthetic quality, it has flexibility, and most importantly, it has the ability to make people feel alive. Mihaly doesn't stop at describing how flow occurs in thought. He takes an important step further, analyzing the conditions for maintaining that flow in a modern environment, where distraction comes not from noise, but from the speed and fragmentation of information. He warns that a person can be very intelligent, very knowledgeable, but if they don't know how to structure their thought processes, that intellect will also fall into a state of dispersion. Like a contractor who has all the building materials but no blueprint, the more they think, the more confused they become. He gives examples of writers, novelists, journalists, academics describing the state of flow when words seem to come to them naturally, when ideas connect like puzzle pieces falling into place. But the condition for that to happen is not random inspiration, but habit. They write every day, at the same time, in the same place, with absolute respect for the process. Mihaly calls this the discipline of intellectual flow, a kind of self-management that is not glamorous or flashy but extremely effective. Clear the mental environment, ask a good enough question, start small, and continue even if no results are visible. Like a climber who doesn't need to see the summit, just needs to know they are moving in the right direction. But he also admits that the flow of thought is one of the most easily disrupted types of flow. Because it occurs in silence, with no feedback from the body, no physical interaction to pull you back. Just a notification, a sound, a tangential thought, and you are pulled out of the process. Therefore, creating an environment that protects the flow of thought is the ultimate mental responsibility of a creative person. And when that is achieved, the reward is not just an idea, an article, or an invention. The reward is a state of internally organized living. You no longer feel lost in a world full of data and noise. You have a compass, and that compass is deep concentration. Mihaly also points out another important thing. The flow of thought doesn't necessarily have to lead to grand results. You don't have to write a book or invent a formula. Sometimes it's enough to truly understand a chapter of a book, or record a clear line of thought in a diary, or solve a small math problem. Any action that makes you feel, I'm understanding the world and myself better, is a sign of flow. In business, he suggests that good leaders often possess this ability, thinking in flow. They are not swept away by immediate reactions. They know how to step back, organize information, and find structure in chaos. They don't just work, they think systematically. And in an era where speed often triumphs over depth, this ability becomes a type of mental competitive advantage. Mihaly concludes this chapter with an image that is very unscientific but full of insight. He compares the flow of thought to sitting by a stream in the forest. Initially, the water is murky, you see nothing. But if you patiently sit still, observing without disturbing it, little by little, the water settles. You see the bottom, you see every tiny movement, and then you understand. Clarity doesn't come from running to find it, but from learning how to let thoughts reveal themselves. If you randomly ask 10 people about their job, at least 8 will respond with a sigh. For most of humanity, work is something that must be done, not out of love, but for survival. Work, in the eyes of many, is like a mandatory stretch of road between two vacations, a means to exist, rarely a place to live. But Mihaly doesn't accept that definition. He doesn't deny the fatigue, pressure, or injustice in labor, but he doesn't surrender to them either. He begins this chapter with a gentle but powerful nudge. It's not the nature of the work that makes us miserable, but how we interact with it. And then he leads us into the peculiar world of people who find flow in the most seemingly mundane jobs. Over years of research, Mihaly and his colleagues interviewed hundreds of people working in various fields. Assembly line workers, doctors, mechanics, teachers, programmers, office workers, factory managers, cleaners, engineers. And what surprised him was that flow doesn't discriminate by class or title. A worker welding car frames in a factory can achieve deeper flow than a CEO if they feel in control of their actions, have clear goals, receive immediate feedback, and especially feel themselves improving every day. He tells of a car painter in Chicago. This man did the exact same thing every day, applied a coat of paint to car bodies. But he set himself a series of standards: how to paint more evenly than yesterday to avoid needing touch-ups, to create a surface so glossy that he himself was satisfied. He received no extra praise, no performance bonus. But when asked about his job, he said something Mihaly never forgot. "When I'm painting, I'm no longer a worker. I'm a sculptor of speed." That wasn't flowery language. It was distilled truth from experience. Mihaly contradicts most modern management thinking when he says that work doesn't need external motivation. If structured correctly, it will generate intrinsic motivation. But for that to happen, at least 3 factors must converge. 1. The person doing the work must have sufficient control. 2. The goals must be clear and meaningful. 3. Feedback must be quick and specific. And the paradox here is that in work, the very things seen as pressure there are more flow-generating elements than in leisure activities. According to his research, when asked about their levels of concentration, interest, and meaning, most people rated higher during work than during leisure. But the paradox is they still prefer leisure time because work is associated with obligation, while leisure is associated with freedom. This means people aren't afraid of working, they're afraid of losing autonomy. Therefore, Mihaly proposes a different approach. Instead of trying to reduce workload, why not redesign work as a flow-generating structure? Imagine a marketing team. Instead of giving KPIs, micromanaging, and delighting, the manager presents a clear creative challenge, allows the team to choose its approach, and provides continuous, real-time feedback. Each team member is not just someone following instructions, but someone playing a strategic game. Then, work is no longer a burden. It becomes a vibrant experimental space. Mihaly doesn't deny that some jobs are monotonous, strenuous, or boring, but he argues that even these jobs can be restructured into mental games. A dishwasher can set a goal to clean faster, but also cleaner than yesterday. A truck driver can train their observation and reaction skills in traffic. A salesperson can turn each conversation into an art of persuasion. A key point he emphasizes: flow doesn't come from the superficial interest of the job, but from the depth you create by engaging with it. Mihaly not only emphasizes the individual experience at work, he goes further. Flow is not just an individual issue, but a survival strategy for organizations. A company where everyone works in flow is a self-regenerating energy ecosystem. In contrast, an organization where employees work out of obligation, for KPIs, or for fear of being fired, even if it achieves its goals, will gradually become empty, exhausted, and lose its identity. From that perspective, management is no longer about supervising progress, but about creating an environment for flow to emerge. The role of leadership, according to Mihaly, is not to motivate or inspire, but to design work structures so that everyone can find immersion, appropriate challenges, clear goals, and authentic feedback. And that doesn't necessarily require a large budget. Many companies have achieved this simply by restructuring tasks, allowing employees to propose improvements, creating internal feedback loops, dividing goals into small teams, and introducing creative elements into repetitive work. Flow, according to Mihaly, doesn't need grand gestures. It needs mental logic. He tells of an emergency room nurse who described feeling in flow while caring for patients. Despite the stressful environment, she felt she was living true to her values. The reason was that she didn't see each action as work, but as a link in the human recovery process. Flow occurs when every small action is part of a larger framework of meaning. Without that framework, any job will eventually become meaningless. Mihaly also exposes a common illusion, that working hard means sacrificing joy. In fact, he argues that those who experience the most flow in their work are the happiest, not because they work less, but because each hour of their work has a very high density of living. These are the types of people who don't need to de-stress when they get home because they don't accumulate stress during the day. They use energy in a structured way. Another key concept Mihaly introduces is intrinsic motivation in work, the ability to generate motivation from the action itself without needing external rewards or control. He clarifies that any management system that relies too heavily on external rewards, from salary to praise, will cause people to lose this ability, and once lost, it's very difficult to regain. Therefore, he calls for a revolution in thinking about how we view work. Don't ask, "Is this job interesting?" Ask, how can I create flow from it? And to do that, we must change how we are present in our work. Not doing it just to finish, not doing it for recognition, not doing it out of fear of failure, but doing it because the process itself brings life, like a chef seasoning food, an engineer refining a design, a researcher connecting data. Every moment is a meaningful unit of life. He concludes this chapter with an insight that, if understood correctly, can completely change how we approach each morning, each job. If structured as a mental game, work can become a source of life, and you don't need to change careers to live a worthwhile life. You just need to change how you live with an asterisk that career. In a world where everyone is talking, or pretending to, the ability to sit alone, without speaking, without a phone, without needing anyone to confirm one's existence, is a rare superpower. Mihaly calls it the art of voluntary solitude. This chapter begins with a paradox strong enough to make anyone living in the age of connection wince. Loneliness doesn't kill people. It's the feeling of not knowing what to do when alone that does. What makes people fear solitude isn't the absence of others, but the lack of organization in their inner life when no one is there to distract them. Mihaly recounts one of the most striking discoveries from his research. People who frequently achieve flow not only know how to live with others, but also know how to live alone. Not a bitter kind of solitude, but an internal independence where they can enter a state of flow even when no one else is around. No social script, no audience, just them, their consciousness, and a structured activity. He describes this type of person as craftsmen of the inner world. They can sit for hours reading, writing, reflecting, painting, arranging flowers, playing music, planning, cleaning, not for anyone, not to show off, not for a photo to post on a story, but because the process itself gives them a sense of completeness. They are not lonely because they are a self-sustaining ecosystem, and that is a kind of flow no one can take away. But then Mihaly reverses the situation. He points out that humans cannot live by themselves alone. And here is another paradox: we need others to understand ourselves better. The frightening thing is that many people think they are living in relationships, but are actually just living through reactions. They talk to fill silence. They communicate to prove they still exist, and they love, hate, resent, care not based on genuine presence, but on a role they play. Mihaly doesn't deny the complexity of relationships. He doesn't naively believe that love alone will create flow. On the contrary, he points out that the closer a relationship, the greater the risk of becoming a factory for micro-conflicts. Familiarity makes people easily take each other for granted, overlook efforts, and treat each other's presence as obvious. And everything obvious, once not deliberately cared for, easily decays. So can flow occur between two people? Mihaly answers, yes, but with more stringent conditions than we imagine. First, each individual in that relationship must be mentally strong enough not to need the other as a crutch. Not, I can't live without you, but I can live alone, but I choose to live with you because being with you enriches my experience. This requires a very high level of autonomy and is what makes relationships with flow extremely rare. Second, the two people must share a common process with clear, flexible shared life goals. This could be raising children together, collaborating on a creative project, building a habit together, or exploring an intellectual hobby. If two people are just together without actively creating something specific, flow can hardly arise. Mihaly tells of elderly couples who garden together every morning, or friends who write a book together, or two people who climb mountains together and plan trips. In such cases, the relationship is no longer a place for projecting expectations, but becomes a mental structure where each person can immerse themselves, grow, and evolve not through promises, but through structured action. He doesn't deny that relationships can bring suffering, but he points out something often overlooked. Most suffering doesn't come because the other person is bad, but because we ourselves lack sufficient internal organization to enter a relationship as a whole person. Mihaly continues to delve into one of the rarely discussed dark areas of modern society: the fear of solitude leading to dependence on relationships that don't nurture flow. People stay together not because they make each other grow, but because they dare not be alone. They look at each other not to discover, but to reflect their own inner emptiness. And then, like a closed loop, the other person's presence doesn't bring vitality, but only exposes more clearly the misalignment, unresolved wounds, and repressed anxieties accumulated over years. Mihaly doesn't advocate abandoning relationships, nor does he paint unrealistic ideals of romance. Instead, he offers a simple but extremely decisive solution. Learn to live with yourself before entering into any relationship with anyone else. The person capable of achieving flow in solitude is someone who has built a sufficiently strong internal life structure. They don't need anyone to remind them who they are. They don't need praise to feel valuable. And it is precisely this that allows them to enter a relationship as a complete being without demanding, without lacking, without manipulating. And when two such people meet, flow can occur between them, not through perfect harmony, but through a commitment to embark on a shared process, a mental project, a common framework for living. Mihaly calls this a dual flow structure relationship, where each person has their own independent, complete flow and also creates a third flow when interacting with each other. In these relationships, people don't try to please each other, but try to create a worthwhile experience together. Interestingly, that relationship doesn't necessarily have to be romantic love. It could be a deep friendship, a creative partner on the same wavelength, a teacher and student. Any connection, if it has clear mental goals, flexible roles, the ability to give feedback, and a shared desire for growth, can become a space for flow to emerge. Mihaly also points out that modern society focuses too much on interaction and forgets about co-presence. We can say thousands of words, send hundreds of texts, make dozens of calls, yet never truly be present with anyone. Flow in relationships doesn't come from the quantity of contact, but from the quality of presence. Where we don't try to prove anything, don't try to achieve anything, just live fully with each other in the same rhythm. And then he admits that achieving this isn't easy. It requires training, the ability to endure feelings of emptiness, the ability not to react immediately when misunderstood, the ability not to shout for lack of attention. In other words, to have a relationship with flow, you must be willing to pass through the most intense zones of solitude without losing yourself. Mihaly concludes this chapter with a paradoxical image. He compares those who know how to live alone to potters. They sit alone in their workshop, hands kneading each piece of clay. No one watches, no one applauds, but from that solitude, they create form. And when they meet someone else who is also creating something with their own hands, the two don't need to say much. They simply place their work side by side, and a profound dialogue spontaneously unfolds. All order is temporary. That is the first law of life and also what humans endlessly try to deny. We build houses, make plans, establish institutions, write laws. But underneath, chaos always lurks. Accidents, betrayals, illnesses, failures, wars, losses, things that arrive unannounced, overturning all plans without warning. And the question isn't how to avoid chaos, but how we will react when it comes. Mihaly begins this chapter with a very honest acknowledgement. There are flows that are mercilessly cut short. A person in a peak state of creativity loses a loved one. An entrepreneur who just found meaning in work goes bankrupt. An artist who found freedom then contracts a serious illness. The deepest states of living are sometimes pushed into a breakdown so illogical that there's no explanation. But precisely in that darkest place, Mihaly poses a challenging question. Can we trick chaos, not by avoiding it, but by turning it into raw material for flow? He tells of a photographer who lost his entire family in a car accident. For months, the man did nothing but sit in the dark, no photos, no words, no life. Then one day, he picked up his camera again and started photographing trash. Exactly, discarded things, scraps, things no one bothered to look at. Each photograph was a way for him to restore his consciousness by finding small order in the mess. The frames didn't save anyone, but they saved him. That was how he tricked chaos, by imposing structure upon it with his personal consciousness. Mihaly calls it the art of self-organization under impossible conditions, not a kind of fake positivity. Not everything happens for a reason. He doesn't sell beliefs. He offers a tool, a skill to rediscover inner order when there's nothing left to lean on externally. This skill doesn't come from formal education. It comes from repeatedly facing loss and surviving it by creating a structured experience, however small and invisible. Mihaly compares it to a person rowing a boat in a storm. You can't stop the waves, you can't command the sea. but you can hold onto the oar, adjust your rhythm, prevent the boat from spinning aimlessly. And sometimes, rowing in chaos gives you a deeper sense of being alive than at any other time. A key point he makes is that flow does not depend on favorable circumstances. It depends on the structure of consciousness. People who have lived in concentration camps, battlefields, prisons can still achieve flow if they maintain minimal control over how they organize their experience. A prime example is Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust, who described finding meaning even in hell not by denying suffering, but by building a mental framework to embrace it. Mihaly agrees with that and expands. Not everyone can do it immediately. But if you practice creating flow from simple activities every day, you will gradually build an anti-chaos structure in your mind. And when a major upheaval comes, you won't collapse immediately. You'll already have the tools, the skills to reorganize your consciousness under uncertain conditions. Mihaly doesn't romanticize resistance to chaos. He names it for what it is, a counterattack of consciousness against collapse, and this counterattack doesn't have to be heroic. Sometimes it starts with simple actions, continuing to make your bed in the morning, continuing to write in your journal every night, continuing to cook a decent meal. Not for anyone, not to prove anything, but because these actions show that you are still here. You can still create structure. He analyzes a very sharp point. The chaos out there, whether political, economic, natural disaster, or personal loss, actually only destroys you if it makes you abandon the ability to create meaningful experiences. And the moment you no longer believe you can create a worthwhile moment, you have surrendered. That's why Mihaly believes the deepest response to chaos is not to fight it, but to design. You cannot control the storm, but you can redesign your boat, re-establish routines, set small goals, things that seem meaningless but help you regain your footing. He tells of a woman who lost her husband in war. When asked how she got through it, she didn't talk about faith or hope. She talked about learning to bake, not to sell, not to forget, but because baking every day gave her a process. Measuring, mixing dough, kneading, controlling temperature, smelling the rising aroma. All of these created a process that she could control, and that process was where she resided. Mihaly calls this the microstructuring of experience. Meaning, when the world becomes too vast, too chaotic, you narrow your scope but deepen it to a point where no one can intrude. A perfectly brewed cup of tea, a run paced with your breath, a written page not needing a reader. These units of life, if organized correctly, become the nucleus for flow, even in crisis. To reinforce his argument, he points out that most people who overcome adversity don't do so because they are stronger, but because they are good at creating flow under limited conditions. They find a way to put themselves into a process, and let that process protect them from disintegration. Mihaly also points out a subtle trap. People with too many choices in peacetime are often not good at resisting chaos, because they are used to having existing frameworks. When the framework breaks, they don't know where to rebuild from. Conversely, people accustomed to living in uncertainty often have a higher capacity for self-organization. And that's why individuals who have experienced poverty, war, and crisis often have remarkable resilience in situations that modern people find unbearable. From that, Mihaly concludes that the only way to trick chaos is not to defeat it, but to render it valueless within your frame of reference. You do that by not letting events define the experience, but by letting the experience define you. He writes, even in concentration camps, the survivors were not necessarily the strongest physically, but those who still maintained an internal process that they could call mine. It is the act of owning even a small experience that prevents one from being swallowed whole. This chapter ends not with advice, but with an open challenge. Practice living in flow when everything is still under control, so that when chaos comes, you don't have to start from scratch. Because chaos will come, that is certain. But if you are subtle enough, you will know how to invite it into your home, not to surrender, but to turn it into a supporting character in an orderly experience created by yourself. If you strip away all the layers of a life, money, achievements, relationships, fame, what remains is a raw question. What does all this mean? Perhaps you live on the highest floor of a glass tower or in a small room at the end of an alley. You might manage a global enterprise or sell vegetables at a wholesale market. That question still arrives, uninvited, indiscriminately. And if you don't have a structure ready to answer it, it will drown you in a very patient kind of nihilism. Mihaly doesn't treat meaning as a distant metaphysical concept. He approaches it like a system designer approaching an information architecture. Meaning is order in experience. Without order, you perceive life as random, and if everything is random, you will lose the reason to choose, to strive, or to live deeply. He writes, "Humans cannot endure prolonged chaos unless they can tell a story in which that chaos has a place." This means meaning doesn't come from events, it comes from how you connect events. A story, if solid enough, can hold you together even when life begins to fall apart. Mihaly doesn't ask, "Does your life have meaning?" He asks, "Are you organizing your experience according to a structure you choose yourself?" Here he introduces a crucial concept, directed order. You don't need to control everything, but you need a direction. You don't need to explain the entire universe, but you need an internal logic to live by. And crucially, that logic should not be borrowed. He points out that most people live according to pre-existing meanings: religion, tradition, collective belief systems. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you don't take ownership of interpreting those meanings, you become a slave to a mental structure created by others. At that point, all your efforts, however well-intentioned, are the actions of someone living a borrowed life. Instead, Mihaly encourages each person to design their own structure of meaning, like a gardener building their mental garden from scratch. You choose which plants to grow, those are the values you live by. You water them every day, those are your actions. You build fences, lay paths, decorate, that's how you organize your priorities. And each of those decisions, if intentional, will gradually shape a sense of meaningful living. A very interesting point he makes: you don't have to find an ultimate meaning. You just need to ensure that all your experiences are part of a process that you can read, an order like a musical piece where you don't need to know the ending, but each note must fit into a melody. Mihaly tells of a social worker who experienced much personal injustice. Instead of letting those wounds turn him bitter, he chose to use them as material to understand others. With each act of help, he didn't do it out of duty or salvation, but because it reinforced the life story he was writing. No one paid him to do that, but the process of rewriting his mental order from brokenness was the reason he felt his life was not meaningless. Mihaly emphasizes that meaning is not inherent in experience. It is created, and that creation process, if done in a state of flow, becomes a sustainable source of life energy. Mihaly asks a very simple question that few dare to answer honestly. What are you living for? Not career goals, not childhood dreams, and certainly not what your parents wanted. He asks, what is the thread that runs through everything, preventing you from disintegrating when all other roles fall away? If one day you no longer have a title, no one calls your name, no goals to achieve, what remains? And the answer, if there is one, will be the meaning you have quietly built or carelessly lost in your daily actions. He says that those with the strongest flow are often those with a clear structure of meaning. Not because they found a supreme truth, but because they chose a direction and lived consistently with it long enough for it to become their identity. That could be a love for a profession, a belief in justice, an inexplicable commitment to beauty, to nature, to precision, to compassion. And when such people engage in an activity, no matter how small, they can achieve deeper, more lasting flow, because every action they take is a brick laid upon the foundation of something greater than themselves. Mihaly also points out something rarely discussed in theories of happiness. The subtle boredom of modern people comes not from a lack of stimulation, but from a lack of meaning structure. You can travel to 10 countries a year, eat at restaurants every week, have friends, a partner, a stable job, yet still feel empty. Because you don't know where you're going, or worse, but that direction wasn't chosen by you. So how do you design a personal meaning system? Mihaly proposes a 3-layered model. 1. Core values. What you believe is right, not because someone told you, not because of trends. If necessary, you are willing to pay the price to uphold it. 2. Midterm goals. Things you are building, not to prove, but to actualize your core values in practice. 3. Daily activities. Every small action each day, if well designed, becomes a place where you feel you are living in alignment with your system. He calls this the architecture of an orderly life. And when you live within that architecture, you don't need motivation. You don't need anyone to push you, because every action connects to a deeper layer where you feel you are writing a blueprint for life that only you understand, but it makes you want to keep writing. He tells of a middle-aged man who was once an alcoholic, unemployed, and lost his family. This man found no reason to live. Until one day, he went to a community sharing session and heard the story of a younger person on the verge of addiction. He said a few words, then went home. That night, he didn't drink. The next day, he returned, and from then on, he began helping others. Not as a savior, but as someone saving himself by creating flow from lifting others up. Every word, every shared experience was a link connecting him to something larger, a version of life he had never had the chance to experience before. Mihaly believes this is the pinnacle of flow, when it not only optimizes experience, but also creates a structure of meaning for an entire life. At that point, you no longer chase fleeting interesting moments. You design a life where every small moment is part of a grand structure and has intrinsic value. He concludes the chapter with a statement that is not advice but a reminder: meaning doesn't come from outside. It comes from bravely looking into the chaos within and beginning to arrange it into a form you can live with. And if you can do that, you don't just live. You create a reason to keep living, even when all other reasons disappear. We have just completed a strange journey, not long in pages but deep in layers of consciousness, in flow. Flow is not a book you understand immediately after the first read. It's like an underground river, simmering, continuous, requiring you to immerse yourself not just with your intellect, but with the very rhythm of your life. If you've listened this far, thank you not just for your time, but for your presence in a noisy world. Your patient journey through abstract concepts, through each slice of inner life, is an act of courage. Not everyone is brave enough to face the question, am I living or just repeating? I hope you'll leave a comment, any comment about this book. No need for praise or agreement, just be honest. What did you see? What did you not understand? How did it make you feel uneasy? Because sometimes, the act of writing it down is the first step to redesigning your own flow.